I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The ancient Cathedral of St. Eustace stood sentinel against the bitter Yorkshire night, its Gothic spires piercing the star-scattered darkness like accusing fingers. It was the Feast of Epiphany, January 6, 1937, and the great bells that had remained silent through the harsh winter months were finally to ring again. The benefactor's service, though service was perhaps too generous a term for what was essentially an elaborate celebration of wealth and philanthropy, had drawn the county's most distinguished residents to witness the restoration of the cathedral's magnificent pile. Inside the vast nave, warmth battled the penetrating cold as 100 candles cast dancing shadows across stone pillars that had witnessed 7 centuries of human folly and devotion. The assembled company represented the very pinnacle of Yorkshire society. Industrialists whose fortunes had built the modern age, aristocrats whose bloodlines stretched back to the Conquest, and those curious specimens of humanity who seemed to exist solely to facilitate the grand designs of their betters. The evening's program lay upon every velvet-cushioned seat, its cream pages bearing the names of those whose generosity, or perhaps whose guilt, had made possible the restoration of the bell tower. The Very Reverend Dr. Lionel Quarles, Dean of St. Eustace, Lady Isabel Marchmont, patroness and chief benefactress, Mr. Victor Hale, industrial magnate and restoration chairman, Sir Percival Drake, architect of the restoration, Dr. Agnes Barlow, curator of cathedral treasures, Mr. Gabriel Reed, master bell ringer, Miss Celia Arden, soprano, Mr. Jasper Quill, special correspondent, the Yorkshire Herald. Among the lesser luminaries scattered throughout the nave were Miss Phoebe Marsh, the Dean's efficient niece and secretary, and Mrs. Winter, the cathedral's formidable housekeeper whose tenure had outlasted 3 deans and countless scandals. At precisely 11:45, the distinguished gathering began to arrange itself in the crossing, where the cathedral's greatest treasure had been displayed for the occasion. Upon a velvet-draped pedestal stood the silver heart of St. Eustace, a medieval reliquary of extraordinary beauty and incalculable value. The heart, crafted from the finest silver and adorned with garnets that caught the candlelight like drops of blood, bore between its antlers a golden cross that seemed to glow with inner fire. Dr. Agnes Barlow hovered near the reliquary with the protective instincts of a mother watching her child take first steps. A woman of considerable learning and even greater determination, she had devoted her life to preserving the cathedral's treasures against the twin threats of time and human avarice. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and tonight they held a particular intensity that suggested more than mere professional concern. "Magnificent, isn't it?" murmured Victor Hale, approaching the display with the confident stride of a man accustomed to owning whatever caught his fancy. He was a compact, powerful figure whose rough origins showed through the polish of his evening clothes like iron beneath gilt. "I've offered the Dean a considerable sum for it on several occasions, and been refused with equal consistency," Dr. Barlow replied crisply. "The heart belongs to the cathedral, Mr. Hale. It is not a commodity to be bought and sold." Hale's laugh was good-natured but held an edge. "Everything has its price, Doctor, even devotion." Lady Isabel Marchmont drifted toward them with the ethereal grace that had made her the toast of London society before her marriage to the late Lord Marchmont. Widowhood had refined her beauty rather than diminished it, lending her an air of romantic melancholy that made men eager to comfort and women suspicious of her motives. "How morbid you sound, Victor," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had once graced the stages of Europe's finest opera houses. "Surely tonight is about celebration, not commerce." Sir Percival Drake, standing apart with the detached air of a man who found human nature less interesting than the stones he shaped, glanced toward the bell tower with obvious anxiety. The architect's gaunt frame and ascetic features gave him the appearance of a medieval monk, an impression reinforced by his habit of clasping his hands behind his back as if in perpetual prayer. "The bells should have been tested more thoroughly," he muttered, more to himself than to his companions. "The frost has been severe, and metal contracts in such cold." Gabriel Reed, the master bell ringer, approached with the measured tread of a man who understood the weight of tradition. His weathered hands bore the calluses of decades spent coaxing music from bronze and iron, and his eyes held the peculiar mixture of reverence and authority that marked those who served ancient crafts. "The bells are ready," he announced quietly. "They have been blessed by winter, and will sing all the sweeter for it." As the cathedral clock struck the quarter hour, the assembled company fell into expectant silence. The dean, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, raised his hands in benediction. Miss Celia Arden, her dark beauty enhanced by a gown that seemed cut from midnight itself, took her position near the choir stalls, her music held with the steady hands of a true professional. At precisely midnight, the great bells of St. Eustace were to ring out across the frozen countryside, proclaiming the success of the restoration and the generosity of those who had made it possible. But as the cathedral clock began its sonorous count toward 12, something went terribly wrong. The first notes came sweetly enough, the smaller bells chiming in perfect sequence like silver coins dropped into still water. Then, without warning, came a sound that had nothing to do with celebration, a tremendous, discordant clang that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient building, followed immediately by a cry of pain and terror that echoed through the stone arches, like the voice of the damned. The electric lights, already dim in the cathedral's vast spaces, flickered once and died, plunging the assembly into the uncertain glow of candlelight. In the sudden darkness, voices rose in confusion and alarm, but the dean's authoritative tones cut through the babble. "Remain where you are. No one is to move until we have light." When the electricity was restored moments later, the full horror of the situation became apparent. Gabriel Reed stood at the base of the bell tower stairs, his face ashen, supporting the sagging form of a verger who had just descended from the ringing chamber above. "There's been an accident," Reed announced, his voice hollow with shock. "Mr. Hale, he's dead." The news struck the assembly like a physical blow. Victor Hale, who had been among them just minutes before, now lay broken in the bell chamber above, victim of what appeared to be a tragic fall. But as the initial shock began to wear off, Dr. Agnes Barlow's voice cut through the murmur of condolences and speculation. "The heart!" she cried, her usual composure shattered. "The silver heart! It's gone!" All eyes turned to the velvet-draped pedestal, where indeed only an empty space remained. The priceless reliquary had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the faint depression in the velvet where it had rested. The cathedral, which moments before had been filled with the warmth of human fellowship, now seemed to exhale a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. Murder and theft had entered the house of God, and the frozen bells above bore silent witness to crimes that would require more than earthly justice to resolve. Superintendent Harold Finch of the Yorkshire Constabulary, who had been present in an unofficial capacity to ensure the evening's smooth progress, stepped forward with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects. "The cathedral is to be sealed," he announced. "No one leaves until we have statements from everyone present." He paused, his experienced eyes taking in the assembled suspects. For suspects they all were now. "And I shall send immediately for Monsieur Hercule Poirot. If there are answers to be found in this unholy business, he will find them." As the great bells of St. Eustace maintained their ominous silence, the stage was set for a confrontation between good and evil that would test even the legendary powers of the world's greatest detective. In the frozen cathedral, where ancient stones held their secrets close and shadows danced with malevolent purpose, Hercule Poirot would soon arrive to separate truth from deception with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The bells might be silent, but before long they would toll for justice and for the guilty soul whose carefully laid plans were about to crumble beneath the relentless logic of the little Belgian detective's extraordinary mind. The cathedral bells remained silent as dawn crept across the Yorkshire moors, their bronze throats mute witnesses to the night's terrible events. Superintendent Harold Finch had worked through the dark hours with methodical precision, transforming the sacred space into a crime scene while maintaining the delicate balance between investigation and reverence. The assembled company, once celebrants of restoration and philanthropy, now found themselves prisoners of circumstance, confined within walls that had witnessed 7 centuries of human drama, but rarely anything quite so immediate and deadly. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the preliminary examination was complete. Dr. Pemberton, serving as police surgeon, had confirmed that Victor Hale died from massive head trauma consistent with a fall from the bell chamber. Yet something in the physician's manner suggested reservations he was reluctant to voice without further evidence. The positioning of the body, the angle of impact, the curious pattern of the head wound, all raised questions that demanded answers beyond the obvious. The theft of the silver heart presented equally perplexing circumstances. Dr. Agnes Barlow remained adamant that the reliquary had been secure in its place when the midnight peal began. The velvet covering showed no signs of disturbance save for the depression where the precious artifact had rested, as if it had simply dissolved into the winter air. Gabriel Reed, the master bell ringer, had provided the most detailed account of events in the tower, describing Hale's unexpected appearance and his agitated manner, his constant consultation of his pocket watch, his muttered comments about timing being everything. The witness statements, gathered with painstaking care, painted a picture of a man who made enemies as easily as he made money. Lady Isabel Marchmont had spoken of Hale's ruthless business practices with characteristic directness, while Sir Percival Drake had seemed more concerned with the structural integrities of his restoration work than with the human tragedy that had unfolded within it. Each suspect carried their shock differently, like a garment tailored to their individual character, and Finch found himself no closer to understanding the night's events despite hours of methodical questioning. It was then that salvation arrived in the form of a telegram's promise fulfilled. The London Express deposited its most distinguished passenger at the small station with punctual efficiency, and Hercule Poirot stepped onto Yorkshire soil with the precise movements of a man who wasted neither time nor energy on unnecessary gestures. His appearance was exactly as reputation suggested: the egg-shaped head, the magnificent moustache, the immaculate dress that seemed to defy the rigors of travel. But it was the eyes that caught Superintendent Finch's attention. Dark, intelligent, and already absorbing, every detail with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating manuscript. "Superintendent Finch, I presume." Poirot's voice carried the slight accent that had charmed London society and intimidated countless criminals. "I trust the scene has been preserved exactly as you found it?" "Bon. Then we shall proceed immediately to this cathedral of yours, where murder and theft have dared to intrude upon the house of the Almighty." The motor-car journey was brief but illuminating. Finch provided a concise summary of the night's events, while Poirot listened with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that details were the building blocks of truth. When they arrived at St. Eustace, Poirot paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping over the intricate stone carvings with appreciation before stepping into the vast interior. "Order, Superintendent," he murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the cathedral's acoustic embrace. "That is what I observe first. A place designed for order, now disturbed by chaos. It is most instructive." He moved directly to the crossing, where the empty pedestal stood like an accusation. Poirot did not touch the velvet covering, but circled it slowly, his head tilted as if listening to its silent testimony. His eyes, keen as a raptor's, took in the scattered programs, the faint disturbances in the dust patterns, The lingering sense of beeswax and cold stone now mingled with something sharper, more metallic. "The heart," he said, more to himself than to Finch. "A symbol of purity, vanished into the night, and our victim, Monsieur Hale, discovered in the bell chamber above." "Most curious. Tell me, has anyone been permitted to leave these premises?" "Absolutely not, Monsieur Poirot," Finch assured him. "The cathedral has been sealed since the moment we discovered the body. Every soul present at the service remains here." Poirot's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Excellent. Then we have them all, do we not? Every piece of the puzzle, contained within these ancient walls." His gaze swept over the assembled suspects, who watched him with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant curiosity. "Now, Superintendent, we shall arrange them one by one and discover what stories they have to tell. The little grey cells, they are eager to begin their work." The game, for Hercule Poirot, had begun in earnest. Poirot established his temporary headquarters in the Dean's private study, a room lined with theological texts and illuminated by a single tall window that cast pale morning light across centuries of accumulated wisdom. Superintendent Finch arranged the interviews with military precision, ensuring each suspect remained isolated until summoned. The great detective settled himself behind the Dean's mahogany desk with characteristic fastidiousness. His notebook, positioned at the precise angle that experience had taught him, was most conducive to clear thinking. The very Reverend Dr. Lionel Quarles entered first, his ecclesiastical dignity intact despite the strain of the night's events. Poirot observed the man's hands, noting their slight tremor, the way his eyes avoided direct contact when speaking of Victor Hale. Here was a shepherd troubled by wolves in his flock, yet dependent upon their patronage for survival. "You knew Monsieur Hale well, I think?" Poirot inquired, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had coaxed confessions from harder souls than this troubled cleric. "As well as one knows any benefactor," Quarles replied carefully. Victor was generous with his donations, though his methods of acquiring wealth were perhaps not entirely orthodox. The cathedral's needs are considerable, and pure donors are regrettably few. The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Poirot's penetrating gaze encouraged further revelation without demanding it. He made conditions upon his generosity? "Nothing inappropriate," the Dean said quickly, too quickly for complete honesty. He wished to be consulted on certain matters: the placement of memorials, the selection of craftsmen. He had strong opinions about authenticity, particularly regarding the silver heart. "Ah, the heart." He expressed interest in purchasing this treasure. The Dean's composure cracked visibly. "Victor made several substantial offers. I explained repeatedly that such artifacts belong to the ages, to faith itself. Yet the restoration costs have exceeded our estimates considerably. There have been discussions about alternative funding sources." Dr. Agnes Barlow proved more forthright when summoned, meeting Poirot's questions with academic directness. Her office keys remained secure on her chatelaine, she insisted, and the heart had been properly guarded until the moment of darkness. Yet her scholarly precision could not disguise deeper concerns. "The heart has been targeted before," she admitted without preamble. 3 attempts at theft in the past decade, each more sophisticated than the last. I had warned repeatedly that our security measures were inadequate. "You suspected Monsieur Hale of harboring criminal intentions?" Dr. Barlow hesitated, choosing her words with scholarly precision. Victor Hale believed that ownership trumped stewardship. There have been whispers in academic circles about pieces that disappeared from private collections only to resurface in his possession years later. Nothing provable, but enough to make one cautious. Lady Isabel Marchmont arrived before being summoned, her elegant figure draped in furs that spoke of wealth and refinement. Yet Poirot detected something calculated in her presentation, as if she were performing rather than simply existing. "Victor was complicated," she said, her trained voice carrying operatic modulation. "Ruthless in business, yet capable of unexpected generosity. He funded my late husband's archaeological expeditions. Without his support, several important discoveries would never have been made. The implication was clear, though unstated. Poirot filed it away with growing motives and opportunities. And last night? You observed nothing unusual in his behavior? Victor was always unusual, Monsieur Poirot. But yes, he seemed more agitated than normal. He kept checking his watch, muttering about timing. He spoke with Dr. Barlow rather intensely about the heart's security arrangements. After the interviews, Poirot examined the scene with methodical precision. The empty pedestal yielded subtle evidence. A faint trace of jasmine lingering in the air, a single crimson thread caught on the velvet's edge, the curious pattern of dust disturbance that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic theft. In the bell chamber above, Gabriel Reed showed him where a leather strap had been wedged against the tenor's clapper, explaining the discordant note that had preceded Hale's scream. Each piece of evidence added layers to the growing portrait of Victor Hale as a man who inspired both gratitude and resentment. Yet the central mystery remained. How had the silver heart vanished while its would-be purchaser lay dying above? The logistics seemed impossible, yet the empty depression testified to undeniable reality. As morning light strengthened through the cathedral's stained glass, casting rainbow patterns across ancient stones, Poirot found himself confronting a puzzle that challenged even his considerable powers. The little gray cells were working, but the pattern they sought remained tantalizingly elusive, hidden beneath layers of human deception as complex as the cathedral's own Gothic architecture. The morning light strengthened through St. Eustace's ancient windows as Poirot established his methodical examination of the evidence. Superintendent Finch had arranged Victor Hale's personal effects on a table in the vestry, and the dead man's possessions spoke with the eloquence of silent witnesses. The gold pocket watch, its crystal cracked from the fatal fall, had stopped at 11:57, a detail that immediately captured Poirot's attention, given that the tragedy had occurred at the stroke of midnight. Most curious, Poirot murmured, studying the timepiece through his magnifying glass. Our victim was most concerned with timing, yet his watch tells us he died 3 minutes before the appointed hour. The little gray cells, they find this contradiction most stimulating. More intriguing still was a leather portfolio containing detailed architectural drawings of the cathedral's interior. These were not the official restoration plans, but rather personal sketches showing precise measurements of the crossing, careful notations about the pedestal's dimensions, and curious markings that suggested intimate knowledge of the building's hidden spaces. Someone had prepared thoroughly for last night's events, and that someone was Victor Hale himself. Gabriel Reed, summoned for a more detailed interview, proved far more forthcoming in the clear light of day. The master bell ringer's weathered hands demonstrated the complex sequence required for the midnight peal, his movements economical despite his obvious distress. His account of Hale's presence in the bell chamber painted a picture of a man driven by more than mere curiosity. Victor arrived just as we began the sequence, Reed explained, his voice heavy with professional pride wounded by the night's disaster. He claimed he wished to witness the restoration's triumph from its source, but he seemed more interested in the chamber's construction than its music. Kept examining the stonework, measuring distances with his eye, consulting that watch of his every few moments. And his manner, you described him as agitated. Reed nodded gravely. Aye, like a man expecting something to happen. He positioned himself near the opening that leads down to the crossing, said he wanted the best view of the ceremony below. When the leather caught the tenor's clapper and produced that terrible discord, he stumbled backward. I reached for him, but it was too late. The timing remained problematic. If Hale's watch had stopped at 11:57, yet the accident occurred at midnight, what had transpired in those missing 3 minutes? Poirot filed this discrepancy away, with growing certainty that chance had played no role in the night's events. Sir Percival Drake, when questioned about the architectural drawings, revealed depths beneath his scholarly reserve. The restoration had uncovered several medieval features, he admitted, including priest holes and storage chambers built by practical masons who understood the need for concealment during turbulent times. Hale had insisted on examining every discovery, claiming a collector's interest in historical authenticity. The man had theories about hidden treasures, Drake said with barely concealed irritation. He believed the cathedral contained secret passages, chambers where valuables might be concealed during times of strife. Romantic nonsense, but his funding came with conditions that required my cooperation in these fantasies. Miss Phoebe Marsh, the dean's efficient niece, provided crucial information about the electrical failure. She had been stationed near the main switch panel, she explained, ready to ensure the lighting remained stable during the ceremony. The system was old but reliable, requiring deliberate manipulation to fail so completely. I found the main lever thrown down when I went to restore power, she said, her fingers twisting nervously. It takes considerable force to move it, and the safety catches must be released first. Someone with knowledge of electrical systems had sabotaged the lighting deliberately. The implications were clear. The darkness that had provided cover for the heart's theft had been no accident, but rather a carefully orchestrated element in a larger plan. Poirot's examination of the switch panel revealed faint traces of jasmine lingering in the air, the same delicate scent he had detected near the empty pedestal. Miss Celia Arden, when questioned about her perfume, confirmed that she favored jasmine, though she seemed puzzled by the inquiry's relevance. More significantly, she had observed Dr. Barlow engaged in what appeared to be an urgent conversation with someone near the south transept just before the lights failed. I couldn't see clearly in the candlelight, she admitted, but their posture suggested disagreement, perhaps even argument. Dr. Barlow seemed to be refusing something, shaking her head quite emphatically. The soprano's dark cloak showed a small tear in its lining, but the thread was blue, not the crimson fiber found on the pedestal's velvet covering. This detail led Poirot to examine Lady Isabel Marchmont's cape more closely, noting its red silk border and the way she had kept her gloves on throughout the evening, unusual behavior for a woman accustomed to displaying her jewelry. Jasper Quill, the newspaper correspondent, proved observant in the manner of his profession. He had positioned himself strategically to witness the ceremony and had noted several curious details. Hale's repeated consultations with his watch, Dr. Barlow's obvious anxiety about the heart's security, and the way several guests had seemed more interested in the reliquary than in the religious significance of the occasion. Hale made no secret of his desire to acquire the piece, Quill observed. He spoke quite openly about the cathedral's financial difficulties and suggested that practical solutions might benefit everyone involved. Dr. Barlow was not receptive to his suggestions. As the afternoon wore on, Poirot found himself returning repeatedly to the empty pedestal, studying the subtle evidence with the patience of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. The jasmine scent, the crimson thread, the precise pattern of dust disturbance, all spoke of careful preparation and intimate knowledge of the cathedral's layout. Someone had studied this location, planned meticulously for the moment when darkness would provide the necessary cover. The architectural drawings in Hale's portfolio suggested he had been preparing for more than simple theft. The detailed measurements, the notations about sightlines and access routes, the careful study of the building's hidden spaces, all indicated a man who understood that success required thorough preparation. Yet if Hale had been the mastermind, who had been his accomplice? And why had the plan resulted in his death rather than his triumph? Mrs. Winter, the cathedral's formidable housekeeper, provided the final piece of the afternoon's puzzle. Her stern demeanor masked sharp eyes that missed little, and her loyalty to the cathedral ran deeper than mere employment. She had noticed, she admitted when pressed, that someone had been in the vestry earlier than expected, before the service began. "I heard voices where there should have been silence," she said with characteristic directness. "Someone was moving about in the shadows, someone who knew the building well enough to navigate without light. As evening approached, Poirot stood once more in the cathedral's nave, surrounded by the weight of centuries and the complexity of human nature. The little grey cells were beginning to perceive patterns, connections that suggested a plan far more sophisticated than simple theft. The jasmine scent, the electrical sabotage, the architectural knowledge, the precise timing, all spoke of a conspiracy that had required inside knowledge and careful coordination. Yet Victor Hale lay dead, and the silver heart had vanished as completely as morning mist. Someone had turned the industrialist's own plan against him, using his preparation and knowledge to achieve their own ends. The question that remained was not whether this had been murder, but rather which of the assembled suspects possessed both the motive and the means to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. Superintendent Finch approached with the measured tread of a man bearing unwelcome news, but Poirot raised a hand to forestall his report. The great detective's eyes held the satisfaction of a hunter who had found his quarry's trail, even if the prey remained hidden in the shadows. "The heart has not vanished, mon ami," Poirot said quietly. "It is here, somewhere within these walls, waiting for the little grey cells to discover its hiding place, and when we find it, we shall also find our murderer. But first, we must understand why Victor Hale had to die, and who among our suspects possessed the knowledge to turn his own scheme against him." The cathedral bells remained silent, but Poirot could hear them speaking nonetheless, their bronze voices whispering secrets that only the most careful listener could understand. The game was afoot, and the little Belgian detective was ready to match his wits against a mind as calculating and ruthless as any he had encountered. The cathedral's ancient stones seemed to exhale secrets as Poirot stood contemplating the empty pedestal, his mind working with the methodical precision that had unraveled countless mysteries. The little grey cells were beginning to perceive patterns, but one crucial element remained elusive. Objects of such weight and substance as the silver heart did not simply vanish into winter air, even amid the chaos of murder and darkness. It remained somewhere within these hallowed walls, hidden by someone who understood both the cathedral's secrets and the psychology of misdirection with equal facility. Mrs. Winter approached with the measured steps of someone bearing intelligence she found deeply troubling. The cathedral's formidable housekeeper had served these walls for 3 decades, and her sharp eyes missed little of what transpired within their ancient embrace. Her usual stern composure showed cracks of genuine distress as she addressed the little detective. "Begging your pardon, Monsieur Poirot, but there's something you should know about the heating system in the crossing. Someone has been tampering with it." Her voice carried the authority of absolute certainty, the kind that came from intimate knowledge of every stone and beam in the building. Poirot followed her to the ornate iron grating that provided warmth to the cathedral's central space during Yorkshire's bitter winters. The Victorian system was a marvel of engineering, a network of pipes and ducts that carried heated air throughout the building's vast interior. Someone with considerable knowledge had removed several of the grating's decorative panels, creating an opening large enough to accommodate objects of considerable size. Kneeling beside the disturbed metalwork, Poirot examined the evidence with his characteristic thoroughness. The panels hung loose on their decorative chains, and the warm air rising from the ducts carried that familiar trace of jasmine, now mingled with the metallic scent of heated iron. More significantly, the accumulated dust within the ductwork showed recent disturbance, clear evidence that someone had accessed this hiding place within the past day. "When did you discover this, Madame Winter?" Poirot inquired, his magnifying glass revealing scratches on the metal that spoke of careful but hurried work. "Just moments ago, when I went to adjust the temperature for evening. The panels were secure yesterday morning when I checked the system before the service. Someone with knowledge of the cathedral's workings had been at them deliberately." The heating ducts provided an ingenious concealment, accessible from the crossing yet hidden from casual observation. More importantly, The constant warmth would prevent condensation from forming on any metallic object stored within, preserving it from the damage that might result from winter's humidity. This was not the desperate improvisation of a common thief, but the calculated planning of someone who understood both the cathedral's infrastructure and the properties of precious metals. Gabriel Reed, summoned to examine the heating system, confirmed what Poirot had begun to suspect. Victor Hale had shown particular interest in the cathedral's mechanical workings during his previous visits, questioning Reed extensively about the building's infrastructure under the guise of professional curiosity about Victorian engineering. His knowledge would have made the heating ducts an obvious choice for temporary concealment. But why hide the heart at all? Superintendent Finch wondered aloud, his practical mind struggling with the complexity of the crime. If theft was the motive, surely the criminal would have attempted to remove it from the premises entirely. Poirot's response carried the patient authority of long experience with a criminal mind. Because, mon ami, simple theft was never the true objective. The heart was hidden, not stolen, which suggests our criminal intended to retrieve it later under different circumstances. This was not the work of a desperate thief, but rather someone with intimate knowledge of both the cathedral and its treasures, someone who could return when suspicion had passed. The examination revealed additional evidence that supported this theory. Traces of jasmine lingered in the warm air of the ducts, connecting this discovery to the scent detected at both the pedestal and the electrical switch panel. Someone wearing this distinctive perfume had orchestrated every aspect of the crime, from the sabotage of the lighting to the concealment of the stolen treasure. Miss Celia Arden, when questioned again about her movements during the ceremony, provided a crucial detail she had initially dismissed as unimportant. During the confusion following the light's failure, she had heard what sounded like metallic scraping from the direction of the crossing, though she had attributed it to the cathedral's old heating system responding to the sudden temperature change. "It was just after that terrible crash from the bell tower," she explained, her dark eyes reflecting the memory of that chaotic moment. "Everyone was shouting and moving about in the darkness, but I distinctly heard metal against stone. I thought perhaps the heating pipes were settling, but now that you mention it, the sound was more deliberate than that." The soprano's observation provided crucial timing evidence. The metallic sounds she had heard coincided perfectly with the period of darkness, confirming that someone had used those precious moments to access the heating system and conceal the heart. This level of preparation and timing suggested intimate familiarity with both the cathedral's layout and the evening's planned sequence of events. Dr. Agnes Barlow's growing agitation provided another piece of the puzzle. When informed that her departure for London remained impossible, she had demanded to speak with Poirot privately, her scholarly composure finally cracking under the pressure of circumstances. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. "You don't understand the pressures involved," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The cathedral's financial situation is far more precarious than anyone realizes. The restoration has cost nearly twice the original estimates, and our insurance coverage has significant gaps. If anything were to happen to the heart, the cathedral would face bankruptcy." The implication hung heavy in the air. The silver heart represented not merely historical treasure, but financial security for the cathedral's future. Its loss would be catastrophic, but its temporary disappearance might serve other purposes entirely. Someone with access to the cathedral's financial records would understand these pressures intimately. Yet as Superintendent Finch began to focus his attention on the obvious suspects, Poirot found himself troubled by the very neatness of the emerging pattern. The jasmine scent, the electrical knowledge, the architectural familiarity, all pointed toward individuals with clear motives and obvious opportunities. But the little detective's experience had taught him to be most suspicious when the solution appeared too convenient. The crimson thread found on the pedestal's velvet covering seemed to implicate Lady Isabel Marchmont, whose financial entanglements with Victor Hale were becoming increasingly apparent through discreet inquiries. Her elegant cape bore a red silk border that matched the fiber perfectly, and her knowledge of archaeological concealment methods, gained through her late husband's expeditions, provided the expertise necessary for such an elaborate hiding scheme. Miss Celia Arden's possession of specialized tools for adjusting stage equipment, combined with her knowledge of the electrical system's location, made her an equally plausible suspect for the lighting sabotage. Her financial difficulties, revealed through the choir master's indiscreet comments about pressing creditors, provided clear motive for theft. Dr. Barlow's intimate knowledge of the cathedral's treasures and her obvious distress about the heart's disappearance suggested either genuine concern or elaborate misdirection. Her access to the building at all hours and her understanding of medieval hiding techniques made her capable of orchestrating such a complex crime. As evening shadows lengthened across the cathedral floor, Poirot found himself standing once more at the scene of the crime, contemplating the elegant complexity of what had unfolded here. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, each suspect carrying both motive and opportunity, each explanation plausible yet incomplete. The little gray cells worked with increasing intensity, perceiving patterns that suggested a mind of remarkable cunning. Someone who understood that the best hiding place for truth was often in plain sight, disguised as something entirely different. The heating system's violation had revealed the heart's likely hiding place, but it had also exposed the careful planning that had made the crime possible. Someone among the assembled suspects possessed not only the knowledge to commit murder and theft, but the psychological sophistication to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. The question that remained was not simply who had the means and opportunity, but who possessed the particular combination of desperation and calculation necessary to turn Victor Hale's own schemes against him. Superintendent Finch approached with the satisfied air of a man who believed the pieces were finally falling into place, but Poirot raised a hand to forestall his conclusions. The great detective's eyes held the gleam of a hunter who sensed his quarry nearby, but had not yet determined the exact nature of the prey. The bells of St. Eustace maintained their ominous silence, but they would soon toll for justice and for the guilty soul whose carefully constructed facade was about to crumble beneath the relentless pressure of logical deduction. The evening shadows lengthened across St. Eustace's ancient stones as Poirot orchestrated his next moves with the precision of a master chess player. Having identified the heating system as the heart's likely hiding place, he instructed Mrs. Winter to prepare a subtle trap. The formidable housekeeper dusted the inner rim of the disturbed grating with a fine layer of pale chalk, invisible to casual observation, but certain to mark any hand that ventured there. A single screw was left deliberately loose, polished to deceptive brightness, and positioned so that any attempt to access the hiding place would leave unmistakable evidence. "We shall let our fish swim freely in the net," Poirot explained to Superintendent Finch, "but when they attempt to feed, we shall know them by their marks." The systematic examination of personal effects yielded a troubling abundance of evidence. Miss Celia Arden's traveling case contained a compact screwdriver bearing traces of red paint, consistent with the grating's metalwork, along with stage clamps and a vial of jasmine extract. Yet when Poirot examined the tool under his magnifying glass, the paint transfer pattern told a different story than simple guilt. The smears ran inward, from cloth to metal, rather than outward as would occur if the screwdriver had been used to turn the painted screws. "Most instructive," Poirot murmured. "If Mademoiselle had employed this tool for our crime, the paint would be drawn off the screw onto the implement. Instead, we see evidence of deliberate contamination." Jasper Quill's camera equipment provided equally suspicious yet ambiguous evidence. His leather strap, discovered wedged against the bell's clapper, bore markings that matched his camera case perfectly. Yet the correspondent's explanation, while nervous, held plausible elements. In the confusion following the light's failure, anyone might have borrowed or displaced such equipment without his knowledge. Lady Isabel Marchmont's elegant cape yielded the crimson thread found at the pedestal, its red silk border frayed in precisely the right location. But her perfume was a tar of roses, not jasmine, and her account of assisting an elderly patron during the blackout could be verified. More puzzling still was the faint smear of dark dust on her handkerchief, suggesting contact with surfaces that should have been beyond her reach. It was then that the afternoon's most significant discovery occurred. The silver heart was indeed recovered from the heating ducts, nestled within the Victorian ironwork, exactly where logic suggested it should be. Yet Poirot's examination revealed details that transformed triumph into deeper mystery. The precious metal showed no signs of condensation or tarnishing that would result from prolonged exposure to the system's warm, moist environment. "Observe, Superintendent," Poirot said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "This reliquary has not been concealed here since the theft occurred. The metal's condition suggests placement within the past hour or two at most. Someone has been manipulating our investigation, planting evidence to support predetermined conclusions." The implications were staggering. If the heart had been moved recently to its discoverable location, then someone possessed not merely the knowledge to commit theft and murder, but the psychological sophistication to control the investigation itself. This suggested a criminal mind of remarkable cunning, one that understood human nature with clinical precision. Superintendent Finch, despite his growing unease, remained convinced that Lady Isabel represented their strongest suspect. The physical evidence seemed overwhelming. The crimson thread, her financial entanglements with Victor Hale, her knowledge of archaeological concealment methods gained through her late husband's expeditions. Her desperate need to clear substantial debts provided compelling motive, while her presence at the scene offered obvious opportunity. "The case against her is solid, Monsieur Poirot," Finch insisted, his practical mind seeking the comfort of concrete conclusions. "She had every reason to silence Hale and steal the heart. The evidence supports this theory at every turn." Poirot's response carried the patient wisdom of long experience with criminal psychology. "Indeed, mon ami, the evidence supports this theory with remarkable consistency. Too remarkable, perhaps. When the solution presents itself with such obvious clarity, one must always examine the hand that has arranged the pieces so conveniently." The little detective moved to the window, gazing out at the cathedral's Gothic silhouette against the darkening sky. "Consider the timeline, Superintendent. Monsieur Hale's watch stopped at 11:57, yet the discord, the darkness, the cry of death, all occurred at the stroke of midnight. 3 minutes. What transpired in those crucial 3 minutes? This temporal inconsistency had troubled Poirot from the beginning. If Lady Isabel had been the architect of these crimes, she would have needed to ascend to the bell chamber, confront and kill Hale, descend to sabotage the electrical system, hide the heart, and return to the crossing, all within moments and without detection. The physical impossibility of such a sequence suggested either an accomplice or an entirely different scenario. "The plan you propose requires remarkable agility and precise knowledge of the cathedral's infrastructure," Poirot continued. "Lady Isabel, while intelligent, possesses neither the technical expertise for electrical sabotage nor the architectural knowledge necessary for such sophisticated concealment." More troubling still was the growing evidence that Victor Hale himself had been planning something elaborate. His architectural drawings, his detailed study of the cathedral's hidden spaces, his obvious surveillance of the heart's security, all suggested a man preparing his own criminal enterprise. The possibility that someone had turned his scheme against him, using his preparation and knowledge to achieve their own ends, transformed the entire investigation. Dr. Agnes Barlow's revelation about the heart's history provided the final piece of this disturbing puzzle. The reliquary had disappeared before, she admitted, always during periods of financial crisis. always followed by anonymous donations that mysteriously appeared when the cathedral's needs were most desperate. If this pattern represented not coincidence but deliberate strategy, then the current theft might be less about criminal gain than institutional survival. As night descended upon St. Eustace, Poirot found himself confronting a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Someone among the assembled suspects possessed not only the means and opportunity for murder and theft, but the psychological insight to orchestrate an investigation that would lead inevitably to false conclusions. The jasmine scent, the planted evidence, the carefully timed discoveries, all spoke of a mind that understood human nature with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The cathedral's bells remained silent, but Poirot could sense their bronze voices preparing to speak. The trap was set, the evidence examined, the patterns beginning to emerge from the chaos of human deception. Soon, very soon, the guilty would reveal themselves through their own desperate actions, and justice would triumph over even the most elaborate schemes. Yet the final confrontation awaited, the moment when truth and falsehood would separate like oil from water, revealing at last the face of a killer who had dared to commit murder in the House of Gold. The little grey cells worked with increasing intensity, perceiving connections that would soon transform suspicion into certainty and bring this complex investigation to its inevitable, dramatic conclusion. The cathedral's evening shadows deepened as Poirot's carefully laid trap began to yield its first results. Mrs. Winter's chalk dust had indeed marked several hands, but rather than providing clear guilt, it created a web of suspicious traces that seemed to implicate nearly everyone. Miss Phoebe Marsh bore faint powder on her dark sleeves. Dr. Barlow's scholarly fingers showed similar residue, and even Gabriel Reed carried the telltale marks. The abundance of evidence troubled the little detective deeply, for in his experience, genuine criminals left minimal traces, while elaborate trails often indicated careful manipulation. "Observe, Superintendent," Poirot murmured, examining the chalked grating with his magnifying glass. "How our fish have indeed approached the net, but in such numbers that we cannot distinguish the hunter from the hunted. Someone has been very clever, ensuring that suspicion falls upon many rather than few." It was then that Jasper Quill provided the evening's most crucial revelation. The correspondent, reviewing his meticulous notes with journalistic precision, discovered a temporal inconsistency that transformed the entire investigation. His pocket watch, checked repeatedly throughout the ceremony for accuracy, showed that the electrical failure had occurred at 11:58, not at midnight as everyone had assumed. "This changes everything," Poirot declared, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a crucial piece falling into place. "If the darkness began 2 minutes before midnight, then the sequence of events requires complete re-examination. The electrical sabotage preceded Monsieur Hale's death, not followed it, suggesting premeditation of remarkable sophistication." The timeline discrepancy cast new light on every aspect of the crime. Hale's watch, stopped at 11:57, suggested he had died during the electrical failure, not during the midnight bells. The cry that had seemed to accompany the discordant peal might have come from someone else entirely, perhaps designed to misdirect attention from the true moment of death. Poirot's examination of the cathedral's Victorian electrical system revealed the technical expertise required for such precise sabotage. The brass covers protecting the main switches demanded considerable force to remove, and the safety mechanisms had been bypassed with professional competence. When Miss Phoebe Marsh reluctantly admitted her electrical engineering background, acquired before family circumstances forced her into domestic service, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "The cathedral's systems have no secrets from me," she said with obvious pride mixed with growing anxiety. Sir Percival insisted that someone with genuine understanding supervise any work that might affect the electrical supply during the restoration. Her competence provided both means and opportunity, while her passionate devotion to the cathedral offered motive that might justify extreme measures. Yet Poirot sensed that individual guilt could not explain the complexity of what had unfolded. The physical evidence suggested multiple participants, each contributing specialized knowledge to an elaborate conspiracy. Dr. Barlow's revelation about the heart's history provided crucial context. The reliquary had vanished before during financial crises. She admitted, always followed by anonymous donations that mysteriously appeared when the cathedral's needs were most desperate. If this pattern represented deliberate strategy rather than coincidence, then the current theft might serve institutional survival rather than personal gain. Victor Hale threatened everything we hold sacred, Dr. Barlow said, her scholarly composure finally cracking. His architectural drawings, his detailed measurements, his constant surveillance, he was planning systematic acquisition of our treasures, reducing centuries of faith to items in a private collection. The implications were staggering. Hale's death might represent not simple murder, but desperate defense against wholesale desecration. Gabriel Reed's account of the industrialist's final moments gained new significance. His positioning near the bell chamber opening, his agitated consultations with his watch, his muttered words about timing being everything. As if summoned by the intensity of their discussion, the sharp report of a lock-protesting violation echoed through the cathedral's stone corridors. Constable Moore arrived breathless and pale, stammering that the treasury cabinet had been forced. The lock showed skilled workmanship, and a linen handkerchief lay on the floor, pressed hastily into service as an improvised glove. Predictably empty, Poirot observed, examining the violated cabinet with clinical detachment. He did not mention that the heart had never been stored there, having anticipated this very attempt. Instead, he noted who spoke first, who moved toward the disturbance, who remained frozen in place. The handkerchief bore traces of beeswax and the faintest suggestion of jasmine, though so subtle as to be almost imaginary. Lady Isabel touched her throat reflexively and fell silent. Miss Celia Arden drew her cloak tighter and glanced toward the choir stalls. Sir Percival Drake muttered an oath suitable for sacred spaces, while Quill stood calculating headlines. Dr. Barlow closed her eyes like someone hearing familiar grief return, and Phoebe Marsh arrived from the dean's study with the scent of old paper clinging to her sleeves. Someone has risked much to break an empty box, Poirot observed quietly, handing the handkerchief to Superintendent Finch. Someone needed the world to believe the heart had been both found and lost again. Most instructive, for it tells us that our criminal listened carefully when we discussed its supposed location. The second crime narrowed the circle dramatically. Only those present during the earlier discussions could have known where the heart was allegedly secured. The psychological pressure was mounting, and Poirot could sense desperation growing among his suspects like heat from banked coals. As the cathedral settled into uneasy night, Poirot stood once more where the pedestal's velvet lay waiting, touching the air above it as if feeling for warmth. The bells remained silent, but he could hear them preparing to speak. Someone had relied on fear, darkness, and human credulity, but such arts could not prevail against the relentless logic of the little gray cells. "At first light," he told Finch softly. "We shall begin again, not with questions, but with demonstration. The person who has orchestrated this elaborate deception will find that truth, like justice, cannot be hidden forever in the shadows." The trap was closing, the evidence accumulating, and the guilty party's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble under the weight of their own desperation. Soon, very soon, the bells of St. Eustace would toll for justice, and Hercule Poirot would reveal the face of a killer who had dared to commit murder in the house of God. The first light of dawn crept through St. Eustace's ancient windows as Poirot stood contemplating the accumulated evidence with the methodical precision that had made him legendary. The little gray cells had worked through the night, and with morning came a clarity that transformed suspicion into systematic understanding. The abundance of planted evidence, far from confusing the investigation, had revealed the true sophistication of the criminal mind they pursued. Mrs. Winter's discovery of fresh disturbances in the heating system provided the morning's first confirmation of Poirot's growing theory. Someone had accessed the ducts during the night, not to retrieve anything, but to plant additional items designed to spread suspicion even wider. A silk handkerchief bearing traces of expensive perfume, electrical components that might implicate Miss Phoebe's technical knowledge, even a fragment of sheet music in what appeared to be Miss Celia's careful script. "Observe, Superintendent," Poirot murmured, examining these new additions with his magnifying glass, "how our criminal continues to paint with a broad brush, ensuring that guilt touches many rather than few. This is not desperation, but calculation of the highest order." The little detective's systematic approach to testing his theories began with the most fundamental question, the timeline that had puzzled him from the beginning. He requested that Miss Phoebe demonstrate the electrical sabotage from her position at the panel, timing each movement with Jasper Quill's precise watch. From the panel to the crossing required 57 seconds at a brisk walk, from the crossing to the heating grating another 12, and from there to the bell tower stairs nearly a full minute more. To accomplish electrical sabotage, concealment of the heart, and murder in the bell chamber within our established time frame would require superhuman speed, Poirot concluded, or alternatively, assistance from someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral's layout and hidden passages. Gabriel Reed's demonstration of the bell mechanism revealed another crucial detail. The leather strap that had caused the discordant note showed wear patterns consistent with repeated handling, not hasty improvisation. Someone with detailed knowledge of the bells had prepared this element well in advance, understanding exactly how to create the sound that would mask the crucial moments of the crime. The jasmine scent that had troubled Poirot throughout the investigation now yielded its secrets under systematic analysis. When Miss Celia applied her perfume at his request, the cathedral's air currents carried it toward the nave, not toward the electrical panel. Yet jasmine had been detected at the panel, suggesting someone wearing this scent had stood there deliberately. More significantly, Poirot's examination of Victor Hale's architectural drawings revealed details that transformed their understanding of the industrialist's intentions. These were not the sketches of a simple thief, but the meticulous plans of someone preparing for systematic acquisition. Hale had documented every valuable artifact, studied every security measure, and prepared detailed routes for removing the cathedral's treasures. Monsieur Hale was not planning a single theft, Poirot explained to the assembled suspects, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. He was orchestrating the systematic stripping of everything that makes this cathedral sacred. Someone discovered his intentions and decided that such desecration could not be permitted. The discovery of a service passage connecting the north transept to the bell tower provided the final piece of the morning's revelations. This medieval route, known only to those with intimate familiarity with the cathedral's secrets, would have allowed rapid movement between the crucial locations without detection. More importantly, traces of beeswax found along this passage matched the residue on the handkerchief discovered at the Treasury cabinet. Dr. Agnes Barlow's growing agitation as these revelations unfolded spoke of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble. Her scholarly composure had given way to obvious distress, and her attempts to deflect attention toward other suspects carried the desperation of someone whose options were rapidly diminishing. "The heart has never been stolen," Poirot announced, his words falling into the cathedral's silence like stones into still water. "It has been hidden, moved, and manipulated as part of an elaborate performance designed to conceal the true nature of last night's crimes. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the cathedral and its treasures has orchestrated not merely murder, but a conspiracy of misdirection that required psychological insight of remarkable sophistication." The morning's investigations had revealed the criminal's methodology with increasing clarity. The electrical sabotage, the planted evidence, the false trails, and misdirection all spoke of someone who understood that confusion could be as effective as concealment. By spreading suspicion among multiple parties and creating an abundance of contradictory evidence, the true culprit had hoped to escape detection entirely. Yet the little grey cells had perceived the pattern beneath the chaos. The jasmine scent, the beeswax traces, the architectural knowledge, the precise timing, all pointed towards someone whose love for the cathedral had transformed into something darker and more dangerous when threatened with systematic destruction. As the morning strengthened, Poirot found himself facing the final phase of his investigation. The evidence was assembled, the theories tested, and the criminal's psychology laid bare. Soon, very soon, he would gather all the suspects for the confrontation that would separate truth from deception and bring justice to the house of God. The bells of St. Eustace remained silent, but Poirot could sense them preparing to speak. The trap was closing with mathematical precision, and the guilty party's elaborate facade was beginning to crumble under the relentless pressure of logical deduction. The game was approaching its climax, and Hercule Poirot was ready to reveal the face of a killer who had dared to commit murder in the name of preservation, turning love into the deadliest of weapons. Superintendent Finch approached with news that would accelerate the final confrontation, but Poirot's expression suggested that he had already anticipated whatever revelation awaited. The little detective's eyes held the satisfaction of a hunter who had found his quarry's trail and was now ready to close the distance between suspicion and certainty, between elaborate deception and inevitable justice. Superintendent Finch's morning intelligence arrived with the weight of confirmation rather than surprise. A telegram from London revealed the true scope of Victor Hale's criminal enterprise. Detailed architectural surveys of Yorkshire's most significant religious buildings, correspondence with continental dealers showing systematic plans to strip St. Eustace of every valuable artifact, and legal documents prepared to justify the transfers as necessary sales to cover restoration costs. More damning still, Dr. Pemberton had revised his medical opinion after discovering peculiar bruising across Hale's upper right arm. Narrow, angled pressure marks suggesting leverage applied by a strap or tight loop before the fatal fall. The man was orchestrating wholesale desecration, Finch reported, his voice heavy with disgust. Cathedral treasures across 3 counties were marked for acquisition. This was not simple theft, but systematic cultural destruction disguised as legitimate business. Poirot received this intelligence with the satisfaction of theory confirmed rather than surprise at new revelation. The little grey cells had already perceived the scope of Hale's ambitions, and this confirmation merely validated what systematic analysis had suggested. The bruising evidence, however, provided crucial physical proof that Hale's death had involved deliberate confrontation rather than accidental misfortune. "Most instructive, Superintendent," Poirot murmured, examining the medical photographs with his magnifying glass. "These marks speak of control, of knowledge, of a moment engineered to appear accidental. Someone with intimate understanding of leverage and anatomy created these injuries with calculated precision." The little detective now began his subtle psychological offensive, moving among the assembled suspects with the measured precision of a chess master approaching endgame. He engaged Sir Percival Drake in detailed discussion of the cathedral's hidden passages, remarking on the ingenuity of medieval builders who understood the need for concealment. His observations about structural knowledge being a double-edged sword drew nervous glances between Drake and Dr. Barlow, their professional relationship suddenly carrying suspicious undertones. With Miss Celia Arden, Poirot spoke of the cathedral's extraordinary acoustic properties, how sounds echoed through stone corridors with remarkable clarity. "A cry, mademoiselle, once heard in such a space, can carry to unexpected places, and a voice, when deliberately disguised, might still be recognized by those with trained ears." The soprano's instinctive gesture toward her throat did not escape his notice. The timeline discrepancy became Poirot's most powerful weapon in this psychological campaign. Jasper Quill's precise recording of the electrical failure at 11:58 contrasted with the midnight bells and Hale's stopped watch at 11:57, created a 3-minute window that demanded explanation. Someone had used those crucial moments with extraordinary efficiency, accomplishing tasks that should have required far longer. "Consider, mes amis," Poirot announced to the assembled company, "the remarkable precision required for our criminal success. Electrical sabotage, concealment of the heart, ascent to the bell chamber, confrontation with Monsieur Hale, and return to the crossing, all within minutes and without detection. This suggests either superhuman speed or careful preparation by someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral's layout." Dr. Agnes Barlow's scholarly composure finally cracked under this methodical pressure. Her hands clenched as she spoke of Hale's collector's interest in the cathedral's treasures, her voice carrying barely controlled fury. "Victor Hale was a vandal, Monsieur Poirot. He would have stripped this cathedral bare, piece by piece, until it was nothing but an empty shell. He saw no beauty, no history, no faith, only profit." The passionate outburst revealed depths of personal animosity that transcended professional concern, marking Dr. Barlow as someone whose devotion to the cathedral's preservation might justify extreme measures when faced with systematic destruction. Poirot then orchestrated a dramatic demonstration, positioning each suspect where they claimed to have been during the crucial moments. At his signal, the lights were extinguished, plunging the cathedral into the same darkness that had concealed the previous night's crimes. In the blackness, Gabriel Reed recreated the discordant note that had masked Hale's cry, the ugly sound crawling through stone and marrow with disturbing effect. During those moments of darkness, Poirot listened not to noise but to breath, to the small betrayals of movement that fear draws from the human body. The faint scent of jasmine seemed to drift not from Miss Celia's position in the nave, but from the direction of the service passage, suggesting someone had moved through those ancient corridors wearing borrowed perfume to create false trails. When the lights returned, Constable Moore emerged from the shadows, holding a verger's cloak, found dropped at the passage's threshold, its hem carrying telltale smears of beeswax and grey grit. The garment had not been there when the demonstration began, indicating someone had attempted to dispose of evidence during the recreated darkness. Mrs. Winter's revelation that only 3 keys could access the vestry closet, hers, the Dean's, and Dr. Barlow's master key, narrowed the circle of those capable of acquiring such disguise. The verger's cloak would have rendered its wearer invisible in the cathedral's shadowy corners, part of the building's fabric rather than a suspicious intruder. "Someone wished to be no one at all for a few crucial moments," Poirot observed, his penetrating gaze sweeping over the increasingly agitated suspects. "To move through these sacred spaces with the anonymity of those who serve rather than those who take." The psychological pressure mounted as additional evidence emerged. Gabriel Reed, when questioned more closely about his movements, admitted to being lured along the service passage by a voice that called his name in what seemed the Dean's timbre. In the narrow darkness, something had struck his shoulder, and he had detected both jasmine scent and the tang of beeswax from a glove or cloth. Each revelation added weight to the growing portrait of a criminal mind of remarkable sophistication. The false trails with planted evidence, the artful timing that turned minutes into misdirection, the use of common substances like beeswax and jasmine to blur rather than clarify the investigation, all spoke of someone who understood that confusion could be as effective as concealment. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cathedral floor, Poirot found himself facing suspects whose carefully maintained composures were beginning to crack under relentless pressure. Miss Phoebe Marsh's efficient manner showed signs of strain, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her spectacles. Lady Isabel's aristocratic poise had given way to obvious anxiety, while Dr. Barlow's scholarly detachment had dissolved into barely controlled agitation. The little detective moved once more to the empty pedestal where the silver heart had rested, his voice carrying the quiet authority of approaching revelation. "We have established the means, the opportunity, and the motive. Someone discovered Monsieur Hale's systematic plans for desecration and decided that such destruction could not be permitted. The question that remains is not whether this was murder, but rather which among you possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary to turn love into the deadliest of weapons. The cathedral's ancient stones seemed to exhale judgment as Poirot prepared for the final confrontation. The little grey cells had worked with methodical precision, separating truth from deception, reality from elaborate performance. Soon, very soon, the bells of St. Eustace would toll for justice, and the guilty soul whose devotion had transformed into something darker and more dangerous would face the consequences of crimes committed in the name of preservation. "Superintendent," Poirot announced, his voice resonating clearly in the cathedral's vast space. "We shall gather everyone in the crossing at sunset. The time for observation has ended. The moment for complete revelation has arrived, and with it, the justice that these sacred walls demand." The trap was closing with mathematical precision, and Hercule Poirot was ready to expose the face of a killer whose love for the cathedral had become the instrument of their own destruction. As sunset painted St. Eustace's ancient windows with jeweled fire, the assembled company gathered once more in the crossing where empty pedestals stood as silent witness. Poirot positioned himself with theatrical precision, his compact figure commanding attention despite the cathedral's vast proportions. Shadows stretched long across worn flagstones while flickering candles cast unsteady halos upon stone pillars that had witnessed 7 centuries of human drama. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying clearly through the stone arches, "we gather to speak of order violated most grievously. Someone among you has orchestrated murder and theft with such elaborate misdirection that the investigation itself became part of the performance." His penetrating gaze swept over each suspect before continuing with methodical precision. "Let us first eliminate those who have been painted with false guilt. Lady Isabel, the crimson thread came from your cape, but you brushed the pedestal earlier when admiring the heart, not during the theft. Your perfume is roses, not jasmine, and your movements during darkness were witnessed." Lady Isabel's aristocratic composure showed visible relief as suspicion lifted from her shoulders like a discarded cloak. "Miss Celia, your tools bear paint pressed onto metal, not scraped from it. Your jasmine perfume was borrowed by someone who wished to create false trails. The electrical components found near your possessions were planted to spread suspicion." Poirot turned to the timeline that had troubled him from the beginning, producing Victor Hale's shattered pocket watch. This timepiece stopped at 11:57, yet Monsieur Quill's precise observations revealed the electrical failure began at 11:58. The midnight bells masked a death that had already occurred. He moved toward the heating grating, his voice gaining inexorable authority. The silver heart was hidden temporarily in these ducts, but its pristine condition proved recent placement. Someone moved it repeatedly to support their elaborate deception, finally concealing it in the ancient priest hole behind the altar, where medieval masons understood the need for perfect concealment. Dr. Agnes Barlow's scholarly composure began cracking visibly, her hands trembling as Poirot's logic closed around her like cathedral walls. The electrical sabotage required intimate knowledge of Victorian systems, knowledge possessed by someone who had studied every wire and switch during restoration oversight. The verger's cloak provided perfect anonymity, allowing movement through service passages known only to those with decades of cathedral intimacy. Poirot's voice dropped to carry the weight of final revelation. Victor Hale planned not simple theft, but systematic desecration. His correspondence revealed intentions to strip St. Eustace bare, reducing 7 centuries of faith to auction lots. Someone discovered these plans and realized legal means could not prevent such comprehensive destruction. You confronted him in the bell chamber, Doctor, using his architectural obsessions to lure him there. The bruising on his arm shows deliberate leverage applied with clinical knowledge of anatomy. When he dismissed your pleas, preservation transformed into desperate action. Dr. Barlow's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "He would have destroyed everything sacred, reduced our treasures to profit margins. I tried reasoning, pleading, but he saw only monetary value. Some things belong to the ages, not individuals. You sabotaged the electrical system with wartime skills, creating darkness for concealment. You used the discordant bell to mask his cry, then descended through hidden passages while chaos erupted above. The jasmine scent, the planted evidence, the multiple hiding places, all designed to create confusion while you escaped detection." The confession came in broken phrases extracted by relentless, logical pressure. Dr. Barlow described the confrontation, Hale's arrogant dismissal, the moment when devotion became deadly weapon. The calculated fall, the swift concealment, the elaborate misdirection that followed. As Superintendent Finch moved forward with constables, the cathedral seemed to exhale judgment through its ancient stones. Dr. Barlow offered no resistance, her life's work having transformed into the instrument of her destruction. "I regret his death," she concluded, voice carrying the anguish of someone whose sacred trust had been violated beyond endurance. "But I could not permit the destruction of everything that makes this place holy." The silver heart was retrieved from its true sanctuary behind the altar, where it had rested safely throughout the investigation. As justice claimed its due, the cathedral's bells finally broke their silence, speaking with measured peal that echoed long after the last stroke faded. Poirot stood contemplating the complex motivations that could transform love into deadly weapon, devotion into destruction's instrument. In gathering darkness, he smoothed his mustache with characteristic precision and walked toward winter twilight, leaving order restored in the house of God where chaos had briefly reigned supreme. The bells of St. Eustace remained silent as Dr. Agnes Barlow was led away into the Yorkshire night, her scholarly shoulders bearing the weight of confession with unexpected dignity. Her face, once animated by passionate devotion to the cathedral's treasures, now carried the hollow expression of someone whose life's work had become the instrument of her destruction. She offered no resistance to the constables, her confession having drained her of all will to fight against the inevitable consequences of her actions. Superintendent Finch watched the departure with the mixed satisfaction of duty fulfilled and human sympathy for a criminal whose motives, however misguided, arose from genuine love rather than base greed. "A brilliant piece of deduction, Monsieur Poirot," he observed quietly, "though I confess the motive still troubles me. To commit murder in defense of objects, however precious they might be—" "Not objects, mon ami," Poirot corrected gently, his penetrating gaze sweeping over the cathedral's soaring architecture. Dr. Barlow believed she was defending something far more precious than silver and gold. She saw herself as protecting the very soul of this place, the accumulated faith of 7 centuries. When faced with systematic desecration, her scholarly mind calculated that one life weighed less than the destruction of cultural memory itself. The silver heart had been restored to its place of honor upon the velvet-draped pedestal, its medieval craftsmanship gleaming in the candlelight as if the night's violence had been merely a troubled dream. Yet Poirot knew that the reliquary would forever carry the shadow of what had transpired, a reminder that even the most sacred spaces were not immune to human passion and its destructive potential. The very Reverend Dr. Quarles approached with hesitant steps, his ecclesiastical robes seeming heavier now, weighted with knowledge that violence had erupted within his sacred charge. "The cathedral will survive this scandal," he said with forced conviction. "But the questions it raises about our dependence upon questionable benefactors will require considerable reflection and reform." Miss Phoebe Marsh busied herself with administrative details, her efficient manner masking the shock of discovering that her mentor and colleague had been capable of such calculated violence. The other suspects dispersed gradually into the winter night, each carrying their own burden of revelation about the thin line between civilization and chaos, between devotion and obsession. As the cathedral settled into evening quiet, Poirot found himself drawn once more to the crossing where the drama had unfolded. The space where Victor Hale had stood planning systematic acquisition now seemed to echo with the weight of thwarted ambition and misguided justice. The little detective reflected on the curious mathematics of morality that could transform a scholar into a killer, preservation into destruction. The irony, Superintendent, he observed with characteristic precision, is that Dr. Barlow's actions may well achieve precisely what she sought to prevent. The scandal will likely force the cathedral to sell artifacts to cover legal expenses and restore public confidence. Her desperate attempt to preserve these treasures has virtually ensured their dispersal. Finch shook his head with the weary wisdom of a man who had witnessed too much of human nature's contradictions. Justice served, but at what cost? The cathedral's reputation, Dr. Barlow's life, even Hale's death, all for treasures that may end up in private collections regardless. Poirot's response carried the philosophical weight of long experience with the criminal mind. Perhaps the true tragedy lies not in the outcome, but in the failure of reason to prevail over fear. Dr. Barlow possessed the knowledge to expose Hale's illegal activities through proper channels, yet desperation led her to choose violence over law, passion over patience. Gabriel Reed emerged from the bell tower, his weathered face showing the strain of the night's revelations. "The bells will ring again, Monsieur Poirot," he said with quiet determination. "They always do, no matter what darkness falls upon this place." "Bon," Poirot replied, his voice carrying satisfaction at this promise of renewal. For the bells mark not only time and ceremony, but the eternal truth that after even the greatest storms, there comes the dawn of restoration and hope. As they prepared to leave the cathedral, Poirot paused at the threshold, his egg-shaped head tilted in final contemplation. The great building seemed to breathe around them, its ancient stones holding secrets far older and darker than the night's revelations. He thought of the medieval masons who had raised these walls, understanding that human nature would always find ways to test even the most sacred purposes. "The little grey cells," he murmured, more to himself than to his companion. "They solve the puzzle of how and who and when. But the question of why, that remains as mysterious as the human heart itself. Why does love become hatred? Protection become destruction? Devotion become the deadliest of weapons?" The motor car carried them through Yorkshire's winter landscape toward London and the comfortable certainties of civilization. Yet Poirot knew that the questions raised by this case would linger long after the legal proceedings concluded. In the collision between preservation and profit, between sacred duty and human law, he had witnessed the eternal struggle that made his profession both necessary and profoundly melancholy. Behind them, St. Eustace stood sentinel against the star-scattered darkness, its Gothic spires piercing the night like prayers made stone. The bells remained silent now, but Poirot could hear them speaking. Nonetheless, not of triumph or simple justice, but of the complex harmonies and discordant notes that comprised the eternal symphony of human nature. The case was closed, the criminal apprehended, and order restored to the house of God. Yet Hercule Poirot carried with him the knowledge that the greatest mysteries were not those of murder and theft, but of the human heart and its infinite capacity for both creation and destruction in the name of love. The bells of St. Eustace would ring again, he knew, when time had softened the memory of violence and the cathedral's wounds had healed. But they would toll forever for the truth that even the most noble intentions, when corrupted by desperation and fear, could transform devotion into the deadliest of sins. With a characteristic adjustment of his hat and coat, Hercule Poirot stepped into the winter night, leaving behind the ancient stones that had witnessed his latest triumph over chaos, carrying with him the eternal questions that made each case not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a window into the mysterious depths of the human soul.